My name is Jeremy Tinder. I'm here with David Seidman. We're both security program managers at Microsoft in the Microsoft Security Response Center. We're here today to talk about our security response process and share some of the lessons we've learned about security response over the last 10 years. And in the interest of sharing those lessons to you all and to folks interested in creating a program of their own so that you don't make the same mistakes that we've made. There we go. All right, let me move that mouse. So, security response is primarily, our primary focus is all about the customer. And so one of the questions you need to ask yourselves about your own program is what happens tomorrow if you have a 0-day dropped on your particular product. And at some point, if you create software for your product, at some point somebody's going to find a security vulnerability in it and report it to you or report it publicly, and you're going to have to respond to it. And so the question you need to ask yourselves is, will you be ready? Just hit space bar for me. Oh, there we go. All right. So the folks who aren't familiar with MSRC, we primarily have three focuses: dealing with security vulnerability response, security incident response, and then strategy. And so security vulnerability response is essentially a company-wide process to handle security vulnerabilities in any number of our products, right? So whether it be Windows Phone, Office, in the cloud, Xbox, or even Windows. So we are the single point of coordination and communication when it comes to handling a security vulnerability. When it comes to security incident response, again, we are the single point of contact and coordination. But an incident could be any critical threat in one of those products. So it could also be a security vulnerability, but we have a separate process for managing that. And the purpose of that is to really quickly mobilize resources to ensure that Microsoft responds with the appropriate level of response for that particular critical threat affecting our customers. And the last focus area is really analyzing and monitoring the threat landscape, looking for changes and feeding those changes back into our process and changing our process as we go along. We also do community outreach like this presentation here, and then other types of information sharing programs. Before we get into the various aspects of security response, I do want to touch based on what we consider our methodology and the way security response fits into our overall approach to dealing with security at Microsoft. It really is the last step in what we call the SDL, Security Development Lifecycle. And this larger program is actually designed to protect customers by reducing the number of vulnerabilities in a product or reducing the overall severity of those vulnerabilities when that product is actually in development, right, before we actually ship it. So we deal with those security vulnerabilities, look for them when they're in the development phase, when they're in implementation phase, while they're easy to actually fix, not after release. So if you're looking to create your own security response process and you are not familiar with SDL, haven't created an SDL of your own, highly recommend you also take a look at SDL. And if you have never seen it, we've shared our SDL program at Microsoft.com/security/SDL. Question?
Do you use like Scrum or Agile?
No, we don't. Some of the teams actually within Microsoft do use portions of it, but we kind of have our own methodology for that.
It's kind of similar.
Yeah.
It's somewhat orthogonal in that you can write code using any development methodology, but using the principles of the security development lifecycle, you're keeping security in mind and doing specific things as you develop that code, whatever project management methodology you're using.
Right. Question?
I believe Brian Sullivan has written a book on Agile SDL.
Mm-hmm. Yes, actually, we've heard of it.
That's a great point.
Yep. Excellent point. So, next question. All right, so we've broken down our response process down into 5 different capability areas, and those are engineering, communication, emergency response or incident response, analysis, and then policy and organization. So without further ado, I'll let David talk about policy and organization.
And I'll try and get Jeremy to fix the clicker situation. Now I've really broken it.
Over. There you go.
There we go. So the first thing you need to think of when you're considering security response is getting your executive team on board. A security response is going to be expensive. It's going to require pulling people off of other projects. This is true no matter whether you're a one-person shop supporting a small piece of software up to the largest corporations like Microsoft. Hopefully if you're a one-person shop, you are the CEO, and so it doesn't take much convincing. But regardless, you need to get these people on board. Having the CEO and the executive team on board for security response doesn't guarantee a successful response, but not having them on board is a pretty good sign that you're not going to have a successful response.
Was Steve onboarded or was he on board?
Steve was on board. In fact, the origins of security at Microsoft go back to Bill Gates issued the Trustworthy Computing memo, and Steve Ballmer was right on board with that. So from the beginning, we have had excellent executive support, and it's something we're very grateful for. To support that, you need a ton of different policies. There are actually even more that I didn't put on this slide because I don't even have time to talk about all of these in any kind of depth. But first of all, start with the security development lifecycle. If you don't know how to write secure code, figure that out. Obviously, nobody knows how to write perfectly secure code, but get better at it over time. As part of that, you want to define a bug bar. This is something that lets you know how to prioritize different security bugs against each other. With both the SDL and the bug bar, ours are public. You're welcome to use them. But it's important to figure out for your organization, what types of bugs do you consider serious enough to react to, and what types of bugs will you not fix? What types of bugs will you fix, but only down the road when you get to it? And the more public you can make that, the more detail you can provide, the better, because it lets both your customers or your users and the people who are finding these bugs understand how they're going to be treated. You don't want researchers spending a bunch of time finding bugs that you don't consider important, and you certainly don't want to tell your customers that something that they consider important, you don't. So going along with that is a lifecycle policy that basically explains what products you're going to provide security updates for. There are a lot of nuances here. In general, Microsoft supports products for 10 years of free security updates, but there are many nuances and exceptions, and every company has to figure out for themselves what makes sense there. It gets particularly tricky when you talk about online services. Is there an expectation of stability or that I can stay on a particular version of a service over time or not? And so again, just something you have to figure out for your company. Of course, you're going to need internal procedures. Most people forget this, and then something happens and no one knows who to talk to, no one knows what their job is and what other people's jobs are. At least get some basic skeleton procedures down right now. Figure out who is going to do what, and we'll talk in a minute about what different roles might be. Vulnerability disclosure hopefully is not a new area for anyone. There are lots of different philosophies on how and when vulnerabilities should be disclosed by who and what level of detail. We're not here to talk in detail about that, but have a policy and make sure people are familiar with it. You don't want different people from your company working with researchers and sending different messages, and you want people who are working with you to know what you think is appropriate. Release frequency is something that mostly affects larger organizations. So if you're Microsoft, if you're another large enterprise that releases security updates to consumer products on a regular basis, people like to know when those are going to come around. So setting a schedule and sticking to it is really helpful to them. Even for an internal IT organization, people like to know when their systems are going to go down. So try and get your updates on a regular schedule. It sounds simple, but many people don't do it, and it's really annoying to users. Business principles is a large area. We're not talking here about all the different ethical things that your company should be doing. We're specifically talking about how your company is going to relate to users in a sort of treatment context. Are you going to treat users differently based on some aspects of their demographics? So for example, Microsoft generally makes security updates available for all versions of a product at the same time. Other companies might not do that. They might provide the update to their latest version first, or they might make some users pay to get access. Again, lots of subtleties here, including in Microsoft's policy, but you need to think through who gets special treatment and who doesn't. And lastly, legal is an area that people don't think about until it's too late. If you get a midnight call from your office in, let's say, India, that the employees in that office have all just been arrested, you don't want to be combing the phone book over the internet trying to find a lawyer to represent you. you want to have prearranged for legal counsel in every jurisdiction in which you operate. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have them on retainer, but you at least want to have a phone number of someone to call. When it comes to more complex legal issues that might face your business, you should be thoroughly aware and have a strategy in place for how those laws affect your reaction. Laws on security vulnerability, security response, disclosure vary globally, and so you need to be aware of how all of the different jurisdictions you play in affect your response. So that sounds really complicated, and depending on how large your company is, it may not be feasible for you to really hire a lawyer and do a deep dive into the laws in every jurisdiction, but you should at least have the starts of that strategy and have the contacts so that you can follow up further when it's necessary. Structuring your personnel effectively is a really important thing when it comes to security response, because different people are fundamentally good at different jobs, and having a clear distinction between roles helps people do the right thing in their particular job during an emergency in particular, but also during regular operations. In a larger enterprise, we typically see this structured into a security response center. Microsoft has the Microsoft Security Response Center, and there's similar organizations at larger companies. At smaller companies, in internal shops, these structures may be combined. It's still good if you can dedicate personnel to do that. Obviously, that's expensive and not everyone can do it. But within any organization that has to respond to security vulnerabilities, which is all organizations, there are some roles that need to be assigned to people, and maybe the same people. And these terms we're just kind of putting words on them. This is not industry standard terminology. I don't think we have really good established terminology for these. But this is what we call them. So we have response managers. These are kind of your general purpose project managers for security response. They're people who work with the research community, they work with potentially the press, they work with internal teams, and generally they understand the situation, they understand the security vulnerability, and they work to get the situation resolved. You have response engineers. These are more technical people. They're people who are able to do pen testing, they're able to do fuzzing, they're able to do reverse engineering, binary analysis, static analysis, whatever type of technical analysis is relevant to your business and is relevant to a security vulnerability. The more you're able to do there, the better you're going to be able to understand a vulnerability, understand an issue, and also fix all of the related issues that tend to come up when we find one issue. In larger organizations, we typically see dedicated roles for communication. Communicating about security is hard. It's hard to tell the general public in particular what's going on and what the issues are, and so having dedicated personnel who are good at that is really helpful. And the last thing is, at the largest organizations, we tend to have a large number of partners. These could be anything from business partners to government organizations, non-governmental organizations, you name it. Having someone who can be a direct liaison with those larger partners is extremely helpful to them. They really appreciate it, and it's a really good bang for your buck investment. Lastly, kind of making all of this stuff play together is someone who we'll call an incident responder. That's someone who takes charge in a crisis. So they're there for the most high priority, high severity situations. A public remote code execution 0-day in your biggest product that affects all of your customers, for example, or your website gets hacked and all of the data is stolen. There's a special skill set for that person. That person needs to be absolute calm, cool in a crisis. There might be chaos flying all around, and they need to be able to keep their calm. Oftentimes, the first time an organization deals with security response is in a crisis. So if that's you, if you walk out of here and you don't do any of the stuff that I'm telling you to do, at least figure out who that person is going to be so that when something happens, they can take charge and make everything better. You really want to make sure that that's a separate person, because they really need to be able to step back from the situation and make the hard decisions when it comes down to, we're going to have to spend a bunch of money to do X, and X may have a very indefinite, indeterminate future return. It may have no return at all. It may be that the issue we're going to fix never would have been a problem in the first place. You need someone who can be detached from that situation and make $100 million decisions with 51-49% probabilities. You need somebody who can use indeterminate information and make a good call. I'm going to hand back to Jeremy now to talk about some of the processes we follow when we actually take a security update from inception through release.
So After doing response from vulnerabilities for 10 years, we've pretty much dialed our process in, but we're constantly changing it. And so, as an overview, this is our entire process, one slide. Starts with a vulnerability report, goes through a couple steps, and ends with a release on second Tuesday. Well, this is like really not working. So the first phase of our process is essentially the triage phase, which is to root out non-security issues from security issues. We get a lot of spam, a lot of configuration problems reported to Secure at Microsoft, and so we've got to remove all of that and identify what is in fact an actual security vulnerability report and what is not. So one of the lessons we learned early on a couple of years ago was to don't ever trust spam filtering. So we actually got a vulnerability report, went to our spam folder, we didn't check it. Several months later, the security researcher then went public because we didn't respond to it. And then lo and behold, we had a crisis, and we had to elevate our response because we now have a public vulnerability affecting our customers, which we knowingly knew about, but didn't identify. So one of the changes we made to that was that we will now read every single email that comes into secure@microsoft.com. So that is a big triage step for us. We get like 400, 500 emails a day or so. So we have a dedicated individual or set of individuals to triage. Excuse me?
So you said that the researcher reported the vulnerability publicly, and you guys didn't respond quick enough. Did you guys go after them?
Nope. It's our fault. How can we go after them? They tried to do the right thing and they reported it to us, and I mean, what else are they going to do? So we can't blame them. So yeah, very critical that you definitely be very careful with the triage stage. The other thing that we'll start doing, if we identify it's a security issue, we're going to start synthesizing those technical details in preparation to open a full stage investigation, right? So as part of that, if there's any outstanding questions, if there's any clarifications we need from the security researcher, we'll ask them at that time. And then obviously, if there's a proof of concept that he's sending us, we're going to want some malware analysis done on that before we actually send it across the company. And so we actually have dedicated individuals within MSRC to do malware analysis to actually remove any malicious code if there is in fact any. So it's something definitely keep it in mind, but it's definitely an advanced skill set to have on hand. Next slide. Question.
So your engineering folks are part of MSRC, they're not part of the product organization?
Correct. We have experience in both, but we definitely have, and you definitely need, dedicated technical and non-technical experience in your centralized organization. So I'm more of a program manager running the process, whereas we have dedicated reverse engineers as well. And the reason for that is we provide the different abstract look at a particular vulnerability, or the customer-focused look at, what is the customer risk. And so we don't compete with, what is the cost of fixing a vulnerability.
And that's not to say that there aren't security experts on the product teams as well.
Correct.
There are also those.
Correct. Yep. Question.
Do you find that having everybody dedicated Microsoft kind of limits you to what can be found with triage? I mean, I know you guys probably, recruit the best, of course, in Microsoft, but do you feel like that might limit you to a certain extent, rather than maybe going to like a contracting security firm?
Well, we do both. We do outsource, right? And so we have both to be as flexible and find as much as we can, especially when we're talking about SDL and preventing bugs in the next version of software. Yeah, we totally do that. So, next slide, please. So once we actually open a case and start the full investigation, the product team starts immediately reproducing the issue. And we always start with what's given, right? Whether it be repro instructions or some other type of proof of concept code. The difficult part here is you may not always be given something that's really easy to reproduce, or a proof of concept code that's like you do it every time it works, right? You may be deliberately not given all the information because either the security researcher doesn't know it or they don't want to give it to you, right? So, or they did their best and they're giving you what they have, right? So there's lots of scenarios that you're going to have to modify those repro steps on your own and modify that proof of concept code on your own to truly find the security vulnerability. And you absolutely have to do due diligence in this step, because if you don't, they're going to, again, go public, right? If you just say, I can't repro, and they're going to be like, well, I found this bug, reported it to Microsoft, I did my due diligence, right? And then turns out, if you just tweaked this little value in the default state, you would have reproed it, but he had some configuration or she had some configuration, right? So keep that in mind, and so you absolutely have to do due diligence in reproing. The other thing that you're going to want to identify is the minimum repro, because the security researcher might say, click over here, click this, click that, click here, but in reality, after you analyze it, you go, well, if I just send this, this single, a couple packets of information over the network, boom, doesn't require any user interaction, whereas in the situation that was initially reported to us, it required lots of social engineering, right? So some things to keep in mind. Once you repro the issue, you then need to start taking a look at what is the root cause. And so identifying the minimum repro feeds into how much user interaction is involved, right? So that goes into identifying what is the overall security impact, what is the highest security severity of that vulnerability, and in what configurations is it in. Is it a default? Is it a not default scenario? Is it a configuration that's used by all of your customers? Is it not, right? These are all considerations, risk assessments that you need to do in this particular stage. And to piggyback on what I said on the other slide, if at all, if you're in doubt, definitely fix the issue, right? We've made mistakes in the past by not actually fixing something that we probably should have, right? And so we've made mistakes in that. So if at all possible, make sure you do your due diligence in reproducing the issue, identifying the exact root cause, and then authoritatively making a decision, okay, now we're going to absolutely serve this as a security update or not, and for whatever reasons, so on and so forth. Question?
So far, I think we're talking about triage as it's been handled by MSRC. Figuring out repros also MSRC. Is this where engineering gets involved, or is this entirely handled by MSRC as well?
So triage is definitely MSRC, and actually reproducing the issue, the product team's involved. And they actually they understand, we have a bug bar, so everybody understands that. And if it's a new product team, for example, we'll onboard them to make them familiar with that, because the product team knows where we're going to make a call on a particular vulnerability, but they definitely consult us. And so it's kind of a mutual agreement, I would say. So they're definitely involved in reproducing the issue, and as soon as they reproduce the issue, then immediately looking at root cause, right? And so we actually have both product team and MSRC assets looking at both.
One other follow-up question, if I could. So analyzing root cause, if it's a new issue, obviously it goes on a bug list, et cetera. Do you do anything differently if this has been previously identified? QA found this 2 releases ago, and now this pops up.
Well, let's say there's a regression. You're saying it's a regression?
Is it a regression, or wasn't fixed in the first place?
So that goes to like a slide that's like near the end of the deck, which is finding the deeper root cause of a particular problem. So I'll come back to that.
Actually, no, that's an interesting perspective. Actually, to be fair, we work at the same company. But it's not just a regression. It's if you've discovered something before and somebody made a cost-benefit analysis
and they didn't make the right one,
and then it's been found by somebody externally, it becomes a potentially very different scenario.
Yeah. So, and I hit it. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but you're absolutely right. And we've hit those issues as well, right? And so it spurs, it doesn't really change anything in terms of our process. We go through the same process. We circle back and look at what is the deeper cause here and how can we fix it in the future. And it really comes down to education for us, internal. So, excellent question or comment. So we then start planning. This is absolutely critical, especially if you're a small organization and you don't have dedicated folks. Even when we have dedicated folks, we still run into problems with going on vacation, holidays, so on and so forth, where people just, I'm out. What do you mean you're out? We've got a release. So it happens all the time. And even within Microsoft, we don't have a sustained engineering group with every product team. We have one for Windows, for example, but we don't have one for Office. So these are things, and when you're doing that, obviously security update with our products takes priority, but keep in mind when they're servicing a security update, they're getting pulled off of development of the next version of whatever product it is, right? So it's very costly. That's why you absolutely have to set a schedule those folks, deconflict in this particular stage, and then move forward. So this is also the time to identify the scope of what you're going to fix. Right, so, and this feeds into the next slide when we talk about variant investigation. What are all the variants you're going to be looking for in terms of the same code path, variations of the file format, so on and so forth. So you want to properly define the scope, and the bigger the scope, obviously the longer you're going to take to service the vulnerability. You may not have 3 years, right, to go scrub all your code. You're only going to have a short, finite amount of time, so you need to properly identify what that scope is so you can actually shoot your make your target. Next slide, please. So the variant investigation, this is where you get the return on investment for your security updates. Right? So the last thing you want to do is do all this investigation, all this hard work, release a security update, and the next day the finder says, security researcher, oh, if I tweak this little variable here, got the same problem all over again. So you got to start from scratch. Especially if it's public, you haven't protected your customers at all. So it's very, very important to do a variant investigation. And essentially what you're doing here is you take a look at what the vulnerability is, what the root cause is. You look for other pieces of code that might, where that might have been copy and pasted. You also fuzz. You also do use the same repro steps provided by the security researcher, run those in different ways. And then you're going to be looking for, other parameters within the file format, other portions of that protocol. Right, there's other similar functions, right? So maybe in the same component, maybe in a completely different component, right? There's any number of places that these vulnerabilities can hide. And then in the implementation stage, this actually starts with the variant investigation. We typically start developing fixes once we find them, and we start testing them in parallel. So we have the testers looking for the variants, and then the developers will start developing those fixes and doing functional testing within their component to make sure that the fixes are appropriate. Biggest takeaways here, keep these targeted. A security update's not the time to go in and recode and add new functions and totally scrub something. And the reason for that is you're going to cause regressions. You're going to cause more problems than you actually fix. And so what you want to do is make those fixes as targeted as possible to prevent regressions. But you also want to make those as comprehensive, meaning once you find those variants, fix those. Fix those. And always keep good coding practices. And the reason for that is, while this process is simple, if tomorrow we have another more serious O-Day come in, the product team may need to put this on hold, right? And so they need to use standard change control and do code review so that they can either use this ship vehicle that's going out the door in X number of weeks, or possibly put this on hold and service something's more critical, and then come back to this. So, question? Depends on the product team, depends on the complexity of the code. Obviously there's standards out there, right? So, for example, iDefense, ZDI have 180 days, so we absolutely target that. So we try and target 120, and then that leaves us room to bounce, if you will, or slip. And so a lot of times we'll try and do 60 or 90 even, and then but it all comes down to testing. So we can't predict the problems that could arise in testing. And so if we cause a regression, obviously we have to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, maybe a way to characterize that is, in the fastest, it can be a handful of days for a very, very targeted fix to a single piece of software that has absolutely top priority. In the worst case, we might have to go to an industry body and redefine a standard because there's actually a spec bug in a protocol, and that can take potentially well over a year.
Yep.
So, and you can get anywhere in between that spectrum.
Question?
We have a whole slide on that.
Question.
So in case when the vulnerability is like big and you really need to fix it, but it will require like some rather bigger refactoring, will you put some kind of like a workaround fix, like a temporary fix, a patch, but then we'll address it properly later?
No, not if we can avoid it, right? If it's public, then absolutely. We'll try and put some type of protection out there for customers immediately so that they can protect themselves. But if at all possible, we want the fix to be as comprehensive as possible, because as soon as we go public, the security community is looking at our security update, and they're going to reverse engineer it, and it's only a matter of time before they do and find exploitation of it. So we don't want to go out with something that's not going to protect them in the long run.
Yeah, and this is where you get into the planning phase. Depending on the exact issue, the amount of time you have to spend to be really comprehensive, and even what you define as really comprehensive, can be potentially enormous. And so you have to try and strike a reasonable medium between fixing as many bugs as you can, because obviously you could keep testing and keep fixing bugs indefinitely, since we're never going to get to zero bugs. But then you also want to get something out sooner than that. So you try to use human judgment to strike an appropriate medium. One principle we try to keep in mind is that when we fix the security issue, we're going to shine a spotlight on that area. That's why we consider variance specifically, is because there's going to be attention attracted to that area. And so we try to get everything that's going to be kind of, people are going to be clued into these bugs because of this security update.
And even if the line that temporarily patch means losing some functionality potentially, just to keep the security more tight,
We try at all possible not to break customers and to regress features if at all possible. But if there is something that can't be avoided, then we document it, and we'll get into that a little bit later.
almost like disable that functionality. So, okay, there is a security issue, and if you want to avoid it, you really have to follow this rule and apply such policies and so on.
No, we typically don't want to
Not if we can
do that.
avoid it.
If we can absolutely avoid it. Question.
As part of your prioritization and planning, do you actually talk to customers? I.e., do you try to find out if what you're about to fix has actually had any impact on anyone? Or do you kind of, I guess I would almost call it fly blind, that's to say, okay, we know this could happen, it could be serious if it were to happen, therefore we fix it, regardless of whether there's been any known impact in the real world?
So we typically don't consult customers during an investigation to prevent information from leaking, but we definitely have dedicated individuals on staff to represent customers. And if we have any questions or any concerns regarding that, we definitely consult them, and then they tell us, we have X number of customers, X percentage of our customers are running this configuration, they're going to be impacted, don't advise you to do that, go find something else.
They're going to be impacted only if they're exploited, right?
Not necessarily, right? They could be, the change could break, or change a feature, right? Could break customers in some certain way. So we definitely have to keep that in concern. And we typically do that in the planning phase. If there's any doubt, now, keep in mind, like, the product team knows their code inside and out. And so they will have concerns about that particular scenario, and they'll typically raise that up to us. Hey, there's a chance that, customers in this configuration will be broken. Well, how many customers do we have in that configuration, right? And so that's where we consult the folks that we have on staff for that.
Let me follow up. So if you have a large enough number of those customers, do you go proactively to them and give them a heads up if you know who they are, or do you publish something and let them break?
If it's that severe, then it's something. This kind of goes back to the security advisory.
Yeah, and we'll talk in a little bit about some of the calculations that go into this, assuming we have enough time left. But overall, we try never to get into a situation where people face a bad decision. So we're trying to use what people have told us about how they want their systems to behave, which includes both security and availability, and our knowledge of the ecosystem to predict what would happen. Because one of the problems, of course, is you can't know whether a vulnerability would be exploited once it becomes public until after it does. So we try and predict what would happen, and we feel like we have a pretty good understanding of that, and we're going to talk in a bit about that. So we're trying to make the best decision we can, but we have run into situations where, for example, a fix that we made exposed a bug in a third-party product, and in those cases we would typically work with that third party to get the bug resolved for customers so that they can deploy a hot fix for that product at the same time as our security update, so that they won't be put in a situation where they have to choose between security and availability.
So I will say we will change our ship vehicle depending if we know we're going to break a lot of customers and they're going to be unhappy with us. Obviously, we don't want to do that. So we may change our ship vehicle. Instead of pushing something out on automatic update, we may put it out on a download center instead and release possibly a security advisory, let you make you aware of that, but you have to opt into it. Right? So we have lots of options.
We'll also put in feature control keys and other ways that customers can modify the behavior if we have to make a breaking change, that people can work around that.
Right.
are part of the bigger product. Do you find that engineering or product development has been influenced by the work that MSOC has done in terms of how to make something more patchable, or that you have that ability already and you can take advantage of that in MSOC?
Definitely. I mean, that goes back to SDL and the feedback loop that we have. So if we identify a particular component and we have the serviceability of this is atrocious, right? But the problem goes back to the engineers, right? They have to develop it, so they feel it firsthand. But if there's a sustained engineering org, there's another separate team actually doing the development, so they need to talk to those folks, right? And so a lot of times what we'll do is, once we identify those, we will communicate with the next version of the product team and talk through SDL and use those programs to change that and make it more serviceable. But yeah, excellent question. So on to verification. So if at all possible, we try and prevent as much of these problems as possible, which is why we have quite an extensive testing framework, which lasts a long time, okay? And so at any time, like up into, a couple days before release, we could identify an issue that could be a breaking change for us not to ship on release Tuesday. But we definitely do functional testing. We do independent functional testing to make sure that the fix actually fixes the vulnerability. We do regression testing, automated and manual. Definitely want to not introduce any new bugs. You definitely don't want to reintroduce previous security vulnerabilities. We've done that in the past. Don't do it. Definitely have automated test suites to test for those, okay? Because it happens. It happens. And the last thing is definitely the system integration testing, right? Where your change to that component works with some other component, right? Make sure you're not breaking stuff. So, and the last slide, release obviously is more than just a click of a button. You have to have the infrastructure in place to actually do the servicing, right? If you don't have that, it's kind of hard to respond to security updates. And you want to keep those steps as minimal as possible, because consumers don't click. They don't want to click. Even if it's one click, they're not going to install it. Which is why in a lot of versions of Windows, right, automatic update is enabled by default, right? Because consumers don't want to click. But enterprise, on the other hand, they do. They want full control over that. So you got to provide that for them. And the last part is, most people think that release ends on release Tuesday. Well, in fact, it's just another day for us, because we actually monitor the threat landscape as well as look for potential problems with the actual security update. And they can be slow to arise, depending, because some enterprises take a while to apply security updates. And so we may see, while they're doing their testing after release, we may see something come up a month, maybe even 2 months after the fact. So it's something that you definitely want to keep an eye on. The last thing I want to talk about is really engineering for release. And this goes back to if you don't have the infrastructure in place, it's kind of hard for you to respond to security updates. you definitely want some type of robust installer, because we've had many instances where we've had to do very abnormal types of updates, right? It's not just one DLL. This DLL is not in a location, it's in 5 locations. So there's a lot of variations to configurations that you may need to deal with. Definitely test your update mechanism in beta. Don't release it without testing it, because if you release it, it's a little too late. Back to another comment about scoped updates. Like, a lot of our updates are released in the form of DLLs and that sort of thing. We intentionally try to do that every single security update you released, or can you do some type of supersedence where you get the last one that's good, right? And so instead of applying 50, maybe you just apply 10, right? One for each component, that type of thing. Some things to keep in the back of your mind. And then internal, some things that aren't thought about, trouble ticketing systems, information sharing systems. How are you actually going to do the process? How are you going to do your job? From a response perspective, definitely have the dedicated conference rooms and the phone bridges. The response changes minute by minute, hour by hour, and you don't have the time to go in and negotiate with who's got what priority for a room. You just need to go walk in there and do your job and start looking at the risk of that particular issue. And the last thing I like to talk about, business continuity. We've actually had fires in data centers that that prevented us from actually releasing security updates at some point in time, right? And so we have processes around this, and we're like, what do you mean that you don't have packages for this release? We have a policy around this. Just because they have a policy doesn't necessarily mean they follow it. So you constantly need to check for those things while you go through your process. So it can happen. So
yeah, we've released security updates when the corporate campus had no power. Actually, I'm going to talk about exactly that point in just a minute. We're running way late on time, so I'm going to ask if we can hold questions until the end now, because we're, I think, like halfway through our slides. Yeah. We've got 10 minutes left. So, but I'll stick around after the break, and I'm happy to give out my card and answer questions. But yeah, it's a good question, and we're going to talk about that if we get to it. Communications is a really important skill, and there are a bunch of different aspects to it. One of them is making sure people can get a hold of you. We have secure@microsoft.com. If you know anything about a security vulnerability in a Microsoft product and you want to talk to us about it, secure@microsoft.com is read by human. Even if you're an internal IT shop or a very small company, it costs you essentially nothing to create and publish an email address like that. Just set it up to forward somewhere where people will see it. Someday it may save your bacon. So just do that. Don't think twice about it. It's also important to cultivate relationships with people. There are lots of people working in the community. They may do free testing for you if they like you. If you have a good relationship with people and they find security bugs in your product and report them to you and you fix them, you could have paid someone to do that and instead they gave it to you for free. That's awesome. Buy them a beer. If you do this for Microsoft, we will buy you beer. We will do lots of nice things for you. And truthfully, cultivating relationships is a good thing to do in general. It's not just, we're not just looking for free testing. What we really want to do is build a business relationship with people, and it goes much beyond just a simple bug report. That said, there are going to be people who don't talk directly to you, who you don't talk with, so keep an eye out on the most common public forums, full disclosure, ExploitDB, BugTrack, etc. Again, not too hard to watch them, especially if you're a large company like Microsoft. You may not know this, but you probably have a PR firm who is watching for news traffic about your company. If you provide them a list of sites to monitor, they can look at them for you. They may charge you for it. And the last thing is, especially for a larger organization, you want to have a broad strategy around trustworthiness in your products. So you want to make sure that your customers understand how your security updates and your proactive security work all fit together to make their experience better. You're doing all this work. People should have an accurate perception of what you're doing. Some kind of general principles, and I'm just going to kind of blaze through these. Be consistent. Use the same terms, put stuff in the same location, And be consistent in what questions you'll answer, because if you answer a question today and then tomorrow somebody asks you that question about a different issue and you really don't want to answer it, well, you're kind of giving something away by refusing to answer it. So make up your mind what you're going to say and what you're not going to say and stick to it. Be authoritative. No wishy-washiness. Say something, mean it, and make it so that everyone can trust it. Don't use unofficial sources, use official authoritative sources. Be helpful. Do what you think people would want you to do. Tell them what you think they would want to know to the limits of what you can disclose. Consider that you probably have both a very technical audience, who might be security researchers, IT professionals, and a very non-technical audience of consumers in many cases. It's hard to appeal to both of those, so we like to use either documentation with lots of expandos or kind of a short FAQ section and then really deep technical docs, but just consider that it'll vary by your user base. One key thing to keep in mind, it is better to be silent than wrong. If you come out with bad advice, people will take your bad advice, and then they will never trust you again. So it's much better to take your time, figure out what's actually happening, and give accurate advice, even if it's a couple days later. That's why Microsoft so often responds with, we're investigating the issue. We really are investigating the issue. We're trying to understand it fully so that we can be sure that when we tell you to do something, you're going to do the right thing, and we're not going to have to come back later and tell you to do something different. Is it possible that we get that wrong? Yes, we're not perfect, but we try as hard as we can that we never have to retract information. When you have something that you want people to know, don't try and hush it up. This is the internet age. You can't keep it quiet anyway. Scream it from the rooftops. If you need your customers to take some action to protect themselves, scream it from the rooftops. And use everything you can think of, from Twitter to blogs to your official company website. Get that information out there so people can do the right thing. Okay, incident response. This is my favorite because this is what I actually do on a day-to-day basis. This is kind of your classic breach response. There's not, again, not a great term, but basically we're thinking the most high priority incidents where someone has either compromised your website, they've found and disclosed a vulnerability in your product that is going to be used to attack customers. Your customers or users are actually currently under attack using a new vulnerability where you need to respond right now. So at Microsoft, we have a generic process across the entire company called the Software Security Incident Response Process. And that process is designed to make the right things happen. So we don't actually make the fixes ourselves, but we bring the right people to the table to get the right things done. And actually, probably the hardest part of it is what comes before that. We need to understand what's going on. And for those of you who've been involved in an incident, this will probably sound familiar. The first thing you hear is only that something really bad has happened and you have no other data. So you need to get all the data you can and make sense out of it as quickly as you possibly can. And once you've done that, you need to tell people what's happening and what they need to do to protect themselves, if there is anything they can do to protect themselves. Nobody likes to be in the dark while they're under attack. And then lastly, you want to resolve the problem, and that might be delivering a security update, it might be a tool, it might be some piece of guidance. But there are these steps to follow to get there. And they move from left to right. So we've defined 5 stages of incident response. Watch is kind of the default phase. We have tons of people in a number of different areas looking for evidence that there is something bad happening. So we have our internal corporate network monitoring. We have people monitoring our data centers and our web properties. We have people monitoring the media. We have a bunch of these different people looking for evidence that something bad is happening. And once something is detected and we've evaluated the report and determined that indeed this is not a false alarm, we have an explicit stage to get people out of bed and get them into a room. If you are running an online service, this is probably totally easy for you. You already know what to do if your site goes down, and you can respond to a security incident the same way. If you make traditional software, or if you work for an enterprise IT organization, you may not have this kind of mobilization procedure, but you really kind of need it. At least, again, really simple. Just make a phone tree, figure out what your criteria is for activating it. You'll be good. The next step is to figure out what's going on. And I'm going to talk in a minute about the framework we use for assessing the severity of an issue and how it's likely to progress. But you need to understand what's happening out there in the real world and what's going to happen. You also need to understand from a technical perspective where the bug is and what's going on. That tends to be easier. We're engineers. We know how to debug problems. So that part is actually on the easier end of things. Once you've found the problem you need to figure out what you can do to fix it in the short and long term. I'll talk in a minute about the short term. Long term is typically just a security update. I say just, that makes it sound trivial, it's not. Lastly, once you've stabilized the situation, you've got information out there, people are protected, you're not done. First, you need to make sure that indeed what you thought would work actually did work and the problem has more or less been resolved. And you need to get that information back so that this kind of problem doesn't occur again. And that's a big part of the process, is making sure that we just had a security incident. What can we do to make sure that that type of incident never happens again? And we're going to think as broadly as possible as we can about that. So this is a framework we use to evaluate risk. I wish I had more time to get into this. This single slide could be explained over the course of an hour. You've probably seen the threat, impact, likelihood, risk evaluation metrics. This is kind of a different take on it. This is a practical take. In order for a vulnerability to turn into a problem for your users, you need three things. You need an attacker who knows about the vulnerability and has enough knowledge to exploit it. So there's a difference in knowledge between theoretical details where a POC that makes it crash versus a fully weaponized exploit versus a fully weaponized exploit that also includes a payload. You also need value. So it's great to have a local DOS, but not many people care to make your computer blue screen when you browse to a website. It's a bug, it's a security bug, but nobody's really going to bother to exploit that in general. On the other hand, a bug where when you browse to a website, I can take over your computer, highly, highly valuable. So in general, we tend to see value coming from server DOS, remote code execution, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, but you kind of have to think broadly, what could an attacker do to get money or other value? Might be that they're trying to steal information, etc. But what's the value to the attacker? Lastly, we see that attackers have preferences, and that can both mean that they have particular technologies they like to attack. It can mean geographic preferences. For whatever reason, we see attackers in different regions using different programs to attack victims. Their attacks proceed in different patterns. Some of them are more bursty, others are kind of a slow, steady ramp up, others are kind of a slow baseline, they never really expand. And over time, those again differ by product, differ for your user base, but over time you can figure those out. And we have a lot of experience with this, unfortunately, and so we're able to put all of these things together to make a pretty good prediction, not only of whether a particular bug is going to lead to attacks, but how those attacks will change over time. And so we know if it's going to ramp up really quickly, well, we better get something out absolutely as fast as possible. Facing a different kind of adversary, we know we need to be more comprehensive because they're not going to attack many users now, but if we rush something out, they're going to bypass it very quickly and our fix will not have done any good. So those are the calculations we have to make. Just really quickly, since we're really running over now, you want to make sure, again, get everything out there, be authoritative, be correct, but don't guess, always be correct. You also want to consider what value your information is going to have for an attacker and help only the attackers, not the defenders. There are gray areas, but generally speaking, information is primarily valuable to an attacker or to a defender, so you want to consider that. You want to provide actionable guidance. Customers want to know, how do I know if this problem affects me? How bad am I affected by it? And what can I do to protect myself? And Microsoft uses the security advisory to answer those questions. And actionable is a key word here. We don't want to just alarm people, we also want to give them something that they can do to protect themselves. It may not be good, it may be disabled JavaScript, but at least there's something you can do. So just some key points, highlights that we've learned about incident management. Number one, put someone in charge. Keep information tightly restricted. A widespread internal distribution will quickly lead to a widespread external distribution, and that can influence attacker behavior. When they know that you're onto them, they tend to work nights. Stay calm and carry on. This is really bad. Lots of bad things happen every day. It's not going to help anyone if you panic. Just relax. When you can, do the things that you've done before that worked. Follow precedents, extrapolate from them. You had time to think it through back then. If it applies, keep doing that. And if it doesn't, throw it out. You will find yourself in situations where all of your policies, all of your rules are just wrong, They're irrelevant. They don't apply to the situation anymore. The environment has shifted. And don't hesitate, if that's clearly the case, to throw them out. I mean, you have to strike a balance, obviously, but be a reasonable, rational thinking person and do the right thing when you know what that is. And when you don't, figure it out. Lastly, out of band. There's really three things that drive into an out-of-band release from Microsoft, and you can think of this for your organization as any time that you're going to deviate from your policy and do something that's really high impact, you're considering three main factors. How many attacks are happening? What's happening when the attacker is successful? And what can people do to protect themselves? So typically we look for mitigations and workarounds. Mitigations we consider things that you don't have to do, they're just there, like ASLR or DEP. Workarounds are something you proactively do to protect yourself. And then antivirus, anti-malware, IDS signatures. If you have lots of attacks, lots of damage, no protections, that's when we go out of band. Now as we run completely over.
I'm just going to make a couple closing points. Back to the analysis and the concern brought up earlier about, what if you find a vulnerability that was previously known internal to the company, but is now publicly known? Well, I can tell you what not to do, and that's more than likely it's been a couple years, right? And so that person may or may not be in the same position he's in now. He's probably not going to remember anything that those decisions he made way back then. So you're probably not going to be successful in going to that person and say, what were you thinking? But you can go to management and say, we've got a problem, right? And we need, it's a training opportunity. I'll put it to you that way. Go back to management, say, hey, clearly we've got some training opportunities ahead of us. We've got some mishaps, and we need to educate folks that if there's a security impact, and we have this actually all the time with us, if an internal product team finds a security issue, they're supposed to raise it to our awareness. And then we can, again, go through our process, make a triage decision on that particular security vulnerability. So it all comes down to training.
Really quick on that.
Yep.
MSRC is involved in every security issue that's found during project.
If we are made aware of it, yes.
we also have kind of sister organizations who work on, so it's not just there's kind of a responsive side and a proactive side.
If it's the next version, right? So we actually have a preventative side using SDL that handles all of that stuff. But if it's found internally and the product has already been released, then yes, we're made aware of it. Or if we're not, and we find out about it later, we let them know. You need to let us know about that. Couple just other quick considerations for applying this process to your own processes. Again, with the cloud, right, all eggs are in the basket. The stakes are a lot higher. Take that in consideration when you're defining your process. You may need to make much quicker decisions than you normally would with your other box products. Hardware embedded, again, how are you going to service those? Think about that. Think about serviceability before you actually release it. So I think with that, the last one is just evolve. Learn from your mistakes.
Yeah, this stuff is not static. If we keep this presentation in a year, it will be different. Also, we are not perfect. You will not be perfect in implementation of security response, so continue to get better at execution.
Any other last questions?
Just comment on that. You mentioned security researchers a lot, and just comment on the value that you place on external security research and maybe also on values.
In terms of value, it's absolutely immense. I mean, we value. There are not words strong enough to describe how strongly we like working with researchers outside Microsoft and how much we value our collaborations with them. In terms of bounties, hopefully many of you are familiar with the Blue Hat Prize. If not, we offered a large, I think it was $200,000 grand prize for innovation in memory mitigation technology. On a per bug basis, we don't believe that that's an incentive that the market actually responds effectively to at the current price levels. So basically, the people we talk to say they don't find individual security vulnerabilities to get paid on a per vulnerability basis. They like working as security consultants or for security research firms and finding vulnerabilities either as part of that work or as just for fun. And they don't view the kind of per bug compensation as the way they'd like to get paid.
So we're definitely constantly evaluating our relationship with security researchers and what motivates them, right? And so we're constantly looking at our process and how to adapt to change that. And so, we do that through surveys and stuff, and continually working with them. And so we're definitely open-minded when it comes to that.
And we're open to feedback too. Secure@microsoft.com is routed to the right place. So if you have feedback, please send it to us. Like I said, we're always open to ideas and to talking about it too.
Alrighty. Thank you all for coming.